Bismarck has hit the side of a volcanic seamount. It begins to slide downhill, plowing a deep trough in the bottom clays. Now 100,000 tons of water sucked down by the falling ship.
Cold steel sleeps at 4,790 meters, and something down there is not at rest. A next-gen underwater drone drops into the Atlantic, guided toward the wreck of the battleship Bismarck. Its lights sweep the mud, and the footage leaves experts shaken. Did the ship die, as history says? Or is the wreck telling a different story? Veterans' memories, 4K scans, and past expeditions collide in one chilling dive. Let's revisit survivor accounts and Ballard/MIR missions and map damage that reopens the scuttling-versus-sinking debate. Beacon over a war grave. Far beneath the restless surface of the Atlantic, almost 470 miles west of the French port of Brest, the wreck of the battleship Bismarck rests in eternal silence. It lies upright in the seabed mud at a depth of nearly 4,790 meters, deeper than most mountains are tall. Here, in water so cold and dark that sunlight has never reached it, the once mighty warship has become both relic and grave. This is no ordinary wreck. For Germany, the Bismarck is not just steel twisted by war, it is hallowed ground. More than 2,000 sailors went down with her in May 1941, and the site is internationally recognized as a protected war grave. Nations and explorers alike acknowledge that this patch of seafloor is sacred, belonging not to history alone, but to memory and mourning. Because of that, any expedition that dares approach the wreck does so under the weight of reverence. This is why the modern team did not arrive with divers, torches, or salvage equipment. Human beings could not even survive the crushing pressure at that depth. But even if they could, the ethical boundaries would forbid it. Instead, the chosen witness was an underwater drone, an ROV equipped with high-resolution cameras, sonar arrays, and ultra-sensitive thrusters. This machine was designed to hover with the gentleness of a falling feather, capable of maneuvering without disturbing the seabed, never scraping the steel, and never entering the hollow corridors that once echoed with life. Its mission profile was clear: look, record, and respect. Nothing more. The use of a drone carries both practical and symbolic meaning. Practically, it is the only viable way to reach such depths without exposing human life to danger. But symbolically, it reflects the balance between curiosity and conscience. The wreck is a time capsule locked in the abyss, but it is also a tomb. To disturb it would not only be a breach of international law, but a violation of the unwritten contract humanity has with its dead. The team understood that their cameras were eyes only, not hands. The most delicate parts of the operation were planned with military precision. No physical contact, no attempts to move artifacts, no trespass into the interior. The drone was instructed to glide like a ghost, present but intangible. This restraint is what makes such expeditions an ethical tightrope. On one side lies the pursuit of science, history, and truth. On the other, the moral responsibility to treat the wreck not as a prize, but as a memorial. Every decision was weighed against the need to preserve dignity. Permissions from authorities were secured, international conventions observed, and the mission leaders carried the same gravity as one would to a funeral. For the descendants of the Bismarck's crew, knowing that the exploration was conducted with care is as important as any discovery. To them, the ship is not just twisted metal, it is family. And yet, even with all these safeguards, the act of sending machines down still stirs debate. Should we look at all? Should the silence be broken, even by the faint whir of propellers and the glow of artificial light? These questions haunt not only the historians, but also the crew who monitor the drone's descent on their flickering screens. They know that the abyss they are about to peer into is more than just a chapter of war. It is a graveyard, an open wound, and a legend all at once. But as the drone's floodlights pierce through the blackness and the shape of the bow emerges from the sediment, something unexpected appears. The steel giant is not simply asleep. It carries scars, distortions, and riddles carved by its violent death. This is not just a monument to history. It is a puzzle. And in that first sweep across the deck, the camera records something no one anticipated. The drone's first pass over the bow records more than a monument. It records contradictions. A giant built to roar. In the final years of the 1930s, as Europe edged closer to total war, the German Navy sought to project its strength across the seas. At the heart of that ambition was a single ship, Bismarck. Laid down in 1936 and launched in 1939, she was more than just steel and rivets. She was a floating fortress, a weapon designed to intimidate, to hunt, and to outlast. At over 820 feet long and displacing more than 50,000 tons at full load, Bismarck was among the most formidable battleships the world had ever seen. Her armor belt was so thick, up to 320 millimeters, that she was said to be nearly invulnerable to enemy fire. She carried 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, capable of firing shells that weighed more than a small car and could pierce armor at astonishing ranges. Her engines could drive her through the Atlantic at speeds exceeding 30 knots, a terrifying prospect for Allied convoys that already struggled to survive U-boat packs. To the Nazi regime, she was a symbol of technological might, a weapon meant to restore Germany's dominance on the seas. But symbols often draw fire, and the Bismarck's first breakout mission in May 1941 would prove that. Alongside the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, she slipped into the frigid waters of the Denmark Strait, intent on breaking into the Atlantic shipping lanes. There, she encountered 2 Royal Navy giants, HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. What followed was one of the most dramatic naval duels of the Second World War. The British opened fire first, their shells arcing across the Grey Sea, but within minutes, the Bismarck's gunners found their mark. A shell slammed into Hood's magazine, igniting a cataclysmic explosion. In seconds, Britain's proudest battlecruiser was ripped apart, taking more than 1,400 men with her. Only 3 survived. For Germany, it was a moment of triumph. For Britain, it was a wound so deep that the order was simple. The Bismarck must be destroyed, no matter the cost. What had begun as a breakout had now become a desperate chase. Damaged in the Denmark Strait and leaking fuel, the Bismarck attempted to escape southward, pursued by a relentless Royal Navy determined to avenge the Hood. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and even aircraft carriers were drawn into the hunt. The turning point came on May 26th, when swordfish biplanes from the carrier Ark Royal struck in fading light. Against all odds, one of their torpedoes jammed Bismarck's rudder, locking her into a slow, doomed circle. She was crippled, unable to maneuver, a wounded Leviathan trapped by fate and the sea. The next morning, May 27, 1941, the Royal Navy closed in for the neutralization. King George V, Rodney, and others opened fire at close range. For over an hour, shells rained down, smashing superstructures, disabling turrets, and tearing open the once proud ship. Torpedoes followed, detonating along her hull. Inside the Bismarck, crewmen struggled against the inferno. Fires raged, compartments flooded, and still the engines roared to keep power flowing to the guns. Damage control teams fought desperately, even as the decks above collapsed. Survivors would later testify that orders were given to set scuttling charges, to open seacocks, to deny the enemy the satisfaction of claiming the ship intact. By late morning, the Bismarck was gone, sliding beneath the waves into the abyss. History seemed to close the book right there. The Royal Navy claimed a victory that avenged Hood, while German survivors insisted they had sunk their own ship to preserve honor. To the world above, the outcome appeared simple. The Bismarck was destroyed. But decades later, when cameras returned to the wreck, the scars on her steel whispered a different story, one not of certainty but of contradiction. If the end was settled, why do the scars on the wreck refuse to agree? The wreck that wouldn't lie. When Dr. Robert Ballard's team finally located the Bismarck in June 1989, 4 years after the Titanic discovery, the world held its breath. What the cameras revealed on the seafloor, nearly 3 miles down, was both breathtaking and unsettling. The Bismarck sat upright in the mud, her massive hull still largely intact despite the ferocity of the battle that had sent her there. Her bow loomed from the silt like a cathedral wall, and though her superstructure had been battered beyond recognition, the basic form of the ship remained unmistakable. Ballard's images confirmed that the stern had broken away, lying twisted and separated from the main hull, likely the result of the stresses as she hit the seabed. The main turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons, had torn free under their own weight during the descent and now lay scattered around the wreck, upside down like toppled monuments. In some ways, the wreck's condition contradicted the expectations of historians. If the Royal Navy's gunfire had utterly destroyed the Bismarck, why did her armored citadel remain so intact? Why had so much of the ship's form survived the bombardment that was supposed to have obliterated her? Later expeditions in the 2000s, using MER submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, added even more clarity. Their high-definition footage allowed experts to study the hull in detail, tracing individual shell impacts, torpedo wounds, and areas where the ship's plating had buckled. What emerged was not a portrait of a ship torn apart by firepower alone, but something more complex, a mixture of inflicted damage and catastrophic stress, as she sank. One of the most haunting revelations was just how well preserved much of the wreck remains. The Bismarck had carried wooden teak planking across much of her deck, and decades after the battle, in the frigid, oxygen-poor waters of the abyss, those planks were still visible in places. Strips of wood, faded but intact, clung stubbornly to the steel. In other sections, paint still clung to the armored hull, muted but unmistakable, an echo of the ship's once proud appearance. Unlike wrecks that corrode rapidly in shallower, oxygen-rich waters, the Bismarck sits in a kind of suspended time. The cold preserves her, slowing decay, making her less like a ruin and more like a ghost, frozen in the moment of her destruction. To look at her through the camera lens is to peer into 1941, as though the ship has been waiting silently all this time to tell her story. But the Bismarck's secrets are not limited to her hull. Scattered across the seafloor is a vast debris field that speaks volumes about her last minutes. The masts lie broken, severed from the ship, and hurled aside during her violent descent. Rangefinders, once perched atop her superstructure, now rest half buried in silt, their shattered optics staring blankly into the dark. Secondary gun mounts lie twisted, ripped from their housings as the ship capsized and sank. Each artifact is a fragment of the timeline, marking the chaos of battle, fire, and collapse. By studying their positions and distances from the main wreck, experts can piece together the sequence of the ship's death throes, the moments when her turrets gave way, when her stern tore free, when her upper works disintegrated under the weight of water and pressure. In this way, the seafloor becomes not just a grave, but a crime scene frozen in slow motion. Every scattered object, every bent plate, every fragment of wood is evidence. For decades, these clues have whispered an incomplete truth, one that points in multiple directions. Was the Bismarck destroyed by her enemy's guns, or by her own crew's determination not to surrender? Did the ship break apart because of torpedoes, or because of stresses no steel could endure? Now, with the arrival of new technology, the whispers are about to become a voice. Modern drones, equipped with millimeter-scale scanning, can capture details no human diver or earlier camera ever could. They promise not only to map the wreck, but to interpret its story, turning the debris field from mystery into motive. The new drone's millimeter-scale scans zoom from timeline to motive. Scuttled or beaten to death? The fate of the Bismarck has long stood on a knife's edge between two narratives. On one side are the official accounts of the Royal Navy, which hailed the victory as the culmination of relentless pursuit and overwhelming firepower. British shells and torpedoes, they argue, left the German battleship crippled beyond hope. On the other side are the testimonies of German survivors who swore that orders were given to scuttle the ship, to open sea valves, set demolition charges, and send her to the bottom before she could be boarded or captured. Both stories are plausible, both fiercely defended, and both, perhaps, partially true. But the real question lingers. In what proportion? Was the Bismarck truly destroyed by the enemy, or did her own crew deliver the final blow? This is where the wreck itself becomes the ultimate witness, and where modern drones bring fresh eyes to an old debate. Earlier expeditions had already shown evidence of both external and internal damage, but the detail was coarse, often open to interpretation. Now, millimeter-scale imaging reveals the contours of her wounds with unprecedented precision. Along the hull, drone cameras capture ruptures in the plating, some gaping holes punched inward, others bent outward like peeled fruit. The direction of the bends matters. Metal forced inward signals a blow from outside, shell fire, torpedoes, or the crushing embrace of seawater. But metal forced outward suggests something else, an internal explosion, either from stored charges or systems giving way under unbearable strain. The stern, in particular, tells a brutal story. The new scans highlight deformations that don't quite match what one would expect solely from torpedo impacts. Some areas are twisted inward, as though caved by a hit, but nearby steel is splayed outward, as if pushed from within. Was this the result of pressure equalization as the stern filled and collapsed? Or could it reflect deliberate charges set by the scuttling teams? Engineers scrutinizing the footage disagree, and it is this disagreement that keeps the debate alive. Reading the metal is like reading handwriting etched in steel. The angle of a fracture, the curling of a plate, even the jagged edges of torn rivets, all reveal whether an event came with explosive speed or with crushing, gradual pressure. Drone surveys show what naval architects call petaling, where metal bends outward like the petals of a flower around a puncture. On Bismarck, some of these petals point inward, classic signs of shell or torpedo penetration. Others, however, point outward, more consistent with internal forces. Could both sets of evidence be accurate? Could the Bismarck have been both battered to death by the British and simultaneously finished off by her own crew's scuttling efforts? This duality is what makes her story so haunting. Survivors reported hearing the orders: open the seacocks, set the charges, abandon ship. Yet they also remembered the relentless hammering of shells and the roar of explosions above them. The truth may lie in a grim synergy. The Royal Navy had inflicted mortal wounds, but the German crew may have hastened the inevitable, ensuring the Bismarck's end came swiftly and on their own terms. Still, the wreck refuses to declare one version as absolute. Every scan deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. The bow and midsection tell one tale of external punishment, while the stern whispers of something more deliberate. Historians call it a paradox. Engineers call it conflicting evidence. But for the drone operators staring at the high-resolution feed, it feels like the ship is caught in a silent argument with itself, a steel confession in two voices, neither willing to be silenced. And among all the contradictions, one area of the wreck stands out. A single region of overlapping damage, both inward and outward, both battle-scarred and strangely precise. It is here that the wreck seems to focus its secrets, as though daring anyone to draw a final conclusion. A single region of damage becomes the fulcrum, and the data gets colder. A pattern that chills experts. As the underwater drone traced slow, deliberate arcs along the Bismarck's hull, a bigger picture began to emerge. Individual hits and ruptures were not just random scars of battle, they formed a pattern. When the high-resolution scans were stitched together, experts noticed that the damage signatures lined up along specific frames of the ship, almost like stepping stones of collapse. This was not the profile of a single neutralized shot, nor the abrupt destruction of a decisive torpedo. Instead, it looked like a sequence, a chain reaction where one failure cascaded into another. Engineers call it progressive flooding, when water overwhelms one compartment, spreads into the next, and accelerates until the ship's stability shatters. On the Bismarck, the aggregated passes showed clear evidence that her death may not have been instantaneous, but rather a catastrophic domino effect. The stern tells the harshest chapter of this story. Earlier explorations had shown it separated from the rest of the hull, but the new drone mapping reveals details that deepen the mystery. The framing in this region displays stress concentrations far beyond what a single torpedo should have caused. It appears that as water poured in, the stern bent and twisted under colossal forces until it tore free. Torpedoes may have initiated the damage, but the final break seems to reflect the weight of flooding, compounded by hydrodynamic stress as the ship lost buoyancy. Structural engineers analyzing the digital models noted fracture patterns consistent with what they call terminal loads, forces that appear only in the last chaotic moments, when a vessel is fighting its own destruction as much as the enemy's weapons. This revelation unsettles even seasoned experts. For decades, naval historians framed the Bismarck's demise as a duel of wills. British firepower versus German scuttling. But if the wreck shows evidence of compound failure modes, battle damage igniting progressive flooding that then tore the ship apart, it means the story is not as clean as either side wanted it to be. The Bismarck may not have been sunk solely by her adversaries, nor entirely by her own crew, but by a terrifying combination. Relentless external punishment, amplified by the ship's own structural vulnerabilities. What frightens engineers is not just what this says about one ship, but what it implies about battleship design of the entire era. If the Bismarck, with her immense armor and reputation as nearly unsinkable, could fall victim to compound stresses, then lessons learned from her sinking might be incomplete. Naval architecture has always sought to compartmentalize flooding, to localize damage. But the Bismarck's wreck suggests that under certain conditions, those safeguards fail, and the collapse is exponential rather than linear. It is a nightmare scenario, one that no commanding officer could fully detect in time, and no damage control team could overcome once it began. The footage does not just provide answers, it creates new questions. Was the Bismarck doomed the moment her rudder was struck, not because of enemy precision, but because progressive flooding had already begun? Did her scuttling charges truly speed the end, or were they simply drowned out by forces far larger than anyone aboard realized? And most chilling of all, if her final minutes were governed not by strategy or honor, but by mechanical inevitability, then perhaps her sinking was less a clash of nations and more a cold equation of steel and water. For the experts reviewing these images, the chill comes not only from the deep ocean, but from the realization that their textbooks may not tell the whole story. A ship once thought to have been sunk by valor, vengeance, or choice might have instead been undone by hidden physics, merciless and unseen. The controversy reignites not only how she died, but who gets to decide the truth on a war grave. Memory, law, and the line. We cross. For all the cold precision of sonar maps and forensic scans, the wreck of the Bismarck is not only a subject for engineers, it is also the final resting place of over 2,000 men. Survivors, only 116 out of the original crew, have lived their lives with the shadow of that day. When some returned decades later aboard expeditions, they confronted images of their ship's shattered hull through the lens of submersibles. What they felt was not the clinical excitement of discovery, but the sting of memory. One veteran reportedly broke into silence when the cameras swept past the place where he had last stood as a young sailor. The footage transported him back into chaos, yet also into grief. For these men, dignity came before data. Every rivet filmed, every deck revealed was more than evidence. It was the face of fallen comrades. That sense of sanctity is not only personal, it is codified in law. The Bismarck lies in international waters, but Germany retains ownership and has declared the site a war grave. Under international convention, wrecks where large numbers of service members perished are to be treated as maritime cemeteries. Germany has made its stance clear. No penetration dives, no recovery attempts, no disturbance of the wreck. When Dr. Robert Ballard located the Bismarck in 1989, he himself stressed the importance of respecting the site, treating it not as a trophy, but as a memorial. Later expeditions, such as those using the Russian MER submersibles or ROV surveys in the early 2000s, operated under the same principle. The agreement is simple: look, but do not touch. That is why today's drones, however advanced, are bound by rules of restraint. They may glide over the hull, capture images in dazzling clarity, even generate 3D models, but they may not enter, probe, or recover. Consent, clarity, and care govern every move. Still, even this careful approach does not silence the debate. When the latest drone footage was released, reactions rippled far beyond naval historians and engineers. Many viewers expressed awe at the quality of the images, marveling at how details from 1941 could appear so fresh. Others felt sorrow, as if watching a film reel of tragedy preserved in salt water. But there was also anger. To some, pointing cameras at the wreck, however respectfully, felt like intrusion into a grave. They asked, would we tolerate drones flying over a cemetery, recording every headstone and coffin? Why should the deep be treated differently simply because the dead lie out of sight? That emotional reaction underscores the line. Every expedition risks crossing. For science, footage of Bismarck's ruptured steel helps answer technical mysteries and reshape naval history. But for families of the dead, and for nations still tied to the legacy of the war, those same images may reopen wounds. The ethical dilemma is stark. How much truth can we pursue without dishonoring the silence of the lost? The footage becomes more than evidence. It becomes testimony. And testimony is never neutral. For the research team steering the drone thousands of meters below, that reality presses on every decision. They know they are not only explorers but caretakers, entrusted with a story that belongs to more than themselves. The wreck is both teacher and tomb, its lessons bound up with its silence. At some point, science must bow to memory. And yet, the scans cannot be unseen. They reveal truths that carry weight, that shift narratives, that challenge what we thought we knew. The line between respect and intrusion blurs with every frame. The team must answer the last question: what do we do with knowledge that hurts? The message in the metal. As the last passes of the drone completed their survey, the Bismarck's story emerged with more clarity and more humility than ever before. For decades, debate has raged over whether the Royal Navy's onslaught or the German crew's scuttling charges sealed her fate. The new scans do not provide a neat resolution. Instead, they suggest a blend. External punishment from shells and torpedoes opened the wounds, while internal measures by her crew quickened the end. Progressive flooding, stress fractures, and deliberate sabotage may all have worked in concert, each amplifying the other until no steel could withstand the forces at play. Reconciling these narratives means accepting that the truth is not binary. The Bismarck was both beaten and sunk by her enemies and scuttled by her own men. The metal records, not a single story, but a chorus of endings layered together. This duality forces humility onto everyone who studies the wreck. For engineers, it means acknowledging the limits of design even in ships once thought invincible. For historians, it means resisting the temptation to turn the ship's fate into a simple tale of triumph or tragedy. For descendants of the crew, it means understanding that the men fought bravely and competently, but also that forces beyond their control had already doomed the ship. The message is that history rarely provides clean answers, and the wreck reminds us that certainty often dissolves the deeper we dive. Modern navies have not ignored this. Each expedition to the Bismarck, each scan and analysis, feeds into updated training, risk assessment, and engineering practice. Compartmentalization systems are scrutinized more carefully, progressive flooding scenarios modeled with greater urgency, redundant safety measures, double hulls, and better materials are designed to prevent the domino collapse that doomed the Bismarck. At the same time, military ethics also evolve. The war grave status of wrecks like Bismarck teaches new generations that technology and memory are intertwined, that a vessel's remains are not simply wreckage, but lessons encased in silence. In classrooms and training manuals, the Bismarck is cited not only for her power, but for the vulnerability she revealed in her destruction. But why did the drone's images strike the world with fear, rather than just curiosity? It was not because of ghosts or legends. It was because the footage reminded us of a deeper truth, that human pride in machines, no matter how advanced, will always meet limits when tested by fate. The Bismarck was a marvel of engineering, a ship built to terrify oceans. Yet even she was brought down in a convergence of chance, determination, and physics. That uneasy realization unsettles us, that no design is perfect, no power absolute, no legacy immune to collapse. The metal keeps score, and the score often shows how fragile our certainties truly are. Watching the wreck is like looking into a mirror of hubris and consequence. We see not just a ship, but an idea. That mastery of technology can guarantee control over destiny. The Bismarck disproved it. She shows us that in war and in life, the equation of power is never final. Pride, skill, and strategy can still be undone by weather, luck, or a single vulnerable system. And when the abyss claims the result, the wreck remains to whisper its verdict. The drone rises back toward the surface, its lights fading from the steel giant below. But the questions linger. The Bismarck's metal has spoken quietly, insistently, with contradictions and with truth. And in doing so, it leaves us with an unsettling curiosity. If this deep-sea investigation opened your eyes, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us which part of the Bismarck's story struck you most, and watch the next video on your screen for another case where steel, sea, and human choice collide.